After the fall of Edessa to the Turkish emir Zengi in 1144, news spread in Europe that the Crusader states had lost an important city. In 1145, Pope Eugenius III issued the bull Quantum Predecessoris, calling the Knights of the West to imitate the First Crusade and march on the Holy Land to help the Latin East. By now, Europe's nobles had grown up with stories of the First Crusade. Knights felt eager to emulate legends like Bohemond and Godfrey of Bouillon. Crusade enthusiasm was bolstered by Saint Bernard of Clairvaux, whom the Pope put in charge of disseminating the call to the cross. Bernard, famed for his holiness and learning, electrified crowds with eloquent speeches urging men to crusade. Louis VII, King of France, assembled the French nobility and publicly took the cross from Bernard himself. So many knights followed this example that Bernard ran out of cloth crosses to pin to their coats. In Germany, too, King Conrad III was moved to tears when he heard Bernard preach. Conrad and a whole host of his vassals committed themselves to march east. Conrad and his army departed May 1147. Their march took them through the Byzantine Empire. When Conrad's army arrived in Constantinople, Louis and the French were still a ways behind. Conrad should have waited for Louis, but instead he crossed the Bosporus ahead of him. The Germans marched across scorching central Anatolia. Like the First Crusade, they encountered a Turkish army at Dorylaeum, but Conrad was no Bohemond and arranged his forces too loosely. The Germans were beaten, the bulk of the army lost. With his remaining troops, Conrad retreated to Nicaea to await the French. When Louis arrived at Nicaea, he was alarmed to see the German host so reduced. Louis and Conrad decided to march along the coast this time, heading east towards Syria. The Crusaders were harassed constantly by Turkish attack. Like Conrad, Louis wasn't much of a general, but the French fared better than the Germans, the army surviving, even as it suffered heavy losses. The French managed to hurl back the Turks at Ephesus on Christmas Eve, and again in a major engagement at the Meander Ford. By the time the army reached Adalia, it was remarkable that the French army still existed at all, considering that they were enormously outnumbered by the local Turkish forces, who knew the territory intimately and used it to their advantage. Louis decided that the risk of crossing the mountains north of Antioch was too great. He attempted to contract Italian ships for the remainder of the journey, but his army was too large. Therefore, Louis made the stunning decision to board a boat himself along with his wife, Queen Eleanor, and his household, leaving the remainder of the army to continue the march on land. The French were deeply demoralized and continued on without their king. A contingent of Knights Templar sent from Outremer to aid the passage of the French greatly bolstered the Crusaders in this desperate hour, and without their guidance, perhaps none of Louis's troops would have made it to Syria. Meanwhile, Zengi was stabbed to death in his own bath by a Frankish slave. Zengi's son, Nur ad-Din, took power in Aleppo. He ordered the slaughter of every Christian man, woman, and child in Edessa, then razed the city to the ground so that the Crusaders could not retake it. Raymond of Poitiers, Prince of Antioch, eagerly anticipated the great German and French armies. He was disturbed when he was instead confronted with the battered remnants of the Crusader forces trickling into Antioch, and Louis himself arriving separately. With Edessa destroyed, Raymond urged Louis to put his troops toward an attack on Aleppo. Zengi's heirs were divided, with his son Saif ad-Din holding Mosul and Nur ad-Din controlling Aleppo. But since Louis's arrival in Antioch, more Crusaders had shown up to the south in the ports of Acre and Tyre in the Kingdom of Jerusalem. Also Conrad, who had returned to Constantinople because of illness, had gone on to Acre. Thus Louis chose to combine his forces with those mustering in the south. The later tales of Louis dismissing Raymond's proposal because of a sexual affair going on between the Prince of Antioch and Queen Eleanor are unconfirmed, and likely little more than gossip. After Louis visited the Holy Sepulchre, a war council convened June 24th, 1148 in Acre. The Patriarch of Jerusalem and the Templars favored an assault on Damascus. After much debate, Louis and Conrad agreed. The French and German forces joined with the army of Jerusalem and the Templars, besieging Damascus on July 24. The strategy hinged on a rapid assault of the city, which, without a relieving army, would be forced to surrender quickly. The Crusaders' plan relied on Nur ad-Din and Saif ad-Din being too occupied with mutual hostilities to intervene, but Zengi's sons had made a temporary truce and moved south with their joint armies, intent on preventing a Frankish takeover of Damascus. With the approach of so large a relieving force, the Crusaders recognized that their position was untenable. They withdrew on July 28th, only 4 days into the siege. Louis and Conrad returned home, while Jerusalem renewed her peace treaty with Damascus in 1149. News of the failure spread shock and sorrow all across Europe. Bernard of Clairvaux was devastated. Bernard, confident that God would manifest a victory, had pitched the crusade as a guaranteed success. Bernard's reputation for holiness survived, but he did receive considerable criticism across Europe for the failure of this enterprise, which he had endorsed so wholeheartedly. Both Louis and Conrad had proved to be poor generals, their lack of coordination with one another and poor arrangement of forces leading to the crucial losses in Anatolia. The First Crusade had benefited from the strategic brilliance of Bohemond of Taranto, whose generalship had allowed the Crusaders to triumph repeatedly over the numerically superior Turks. But unfortunately, neither Louis nor Conrad had turned out to be a Bohemond. Also, there's the issue of the Byzantines. To what extent did the Byzantine Empire, under Emperor Manuel Comnenus, help or hinder the passage of the armies of Louis VII of France and Conrad III of Germany? To answer that question, I'm going to turn to Christopher Tyerman and his book, God's War. At Ephesus, the army encountered Greek messengers, warning of Turkish forces massing to attack the Christians if they advanced further, and advising Louis to seek shelter in Byzantine fortresses for the winter. While well-meant and accurate, such intelligence hardly compensated for what later struck some Crusade veterans as Manuel's highly cynical policy. He had failed to provide an adequate flow of provisions, or a large enough shadowing fleet to succor or transport the western host, even if impotent to keep Turkish incursions down the valleys of western Asia Minor from attacking the French. Manuel failed to encourage local Greek officials or citizens to show hospitality, welcome, or open markets. With the German army destroyed, Manuel's policy appeared less nervous, and thus less supportive, his alliance with Louis now redundant. While not wishing the Crusaders ill, Manuel no longer needed to appease or promote their interests, especially if they endangered his own in Anatolia or northern Syria. While the subsequent accusations of Greek perfidy, leveled notably by Louis's chaplain Odo, appear exaggerated and hysterical, especially as criticisms by Louis himself were muted, the king later recalling fondly his relations with Manuel. Rumors of Byzantine obstruction persisted, even in Greek circles. At most, Manuel helped only when and how it suited him. At worst, he ensured, if only passively, that the odds were stacked against the Westerners, disrupting his political and diplomatic arrangements.